Hello and welcome to another episode of News of the Week. Now, last week we talked about the debt ceiling, and obviously that is still not really resolved. But this week we are basically having a kind of continuation in a sense, but in a little bit different direction. As you may have seen in the news, there was a G7 meeting, which is basically a group of 7 very, very strong countries in the world. The United States is part of it, Japan is part of it, the European Union is part of it. And they had an interesting final statement that they published, and they didn't really want to name or did not name any particular country in their final statement. But what they were basically saying is that they are interested in something that reminded me about this old saying, have a cake and eat it too. They basically said they want to create something that they call de-risking, but not decoupling. So decoupling in the past in multiple articles and so forth has been defined as a multi-pronged world. So we used to have like the Cold War where like the United States and Russia were basically at loggerheads all the time. That resolved kind of in the 80s and early 90s. And then the United States basically was recognized as pretty much the last remaining superpower. Since then, or while that was going on, and more recently in the last 20, 25 years, China has been growing. Other countries have been growing too, like India, which is now turning into the most populous country in the world. But economically and otherwise, China has growing a lot. And as we have seen, especially since the start of the Trump administration, there is this, China is our enemy kind of view, which meant we installed tariffs, but that somehow made it harder for China to do trade with us. We have now published, and actually to some people's surprise, the Biden administration has issued and published stronger sanctions and things that businesses, especially American businesses, but now also businesses from Japan, businesses from the Netherlands and so forth, everything that has to do with high tech, whether it's solar panels or semiconductors or computer chips or equipment to make computer chips, all these things have basically been sanctions with the argument that there is an issue of national security, because obviously if you have a very capable semiconductor, you can put it in a computer, you can put it into, like a car, but you could also put it into some military equipment. And this has never been in the past been the argument that because a certain technology can be used in military applications, it therefore cannot be sold to anybody who has a military. Now, decoupling would mean, and a lot of people believe that we are on the way, that there will be new blocks forming that are different than the old blocks. The biggest one that most people know is NATO, which is basically the so-called Western countries, Canada, the United States, and most of the European countries. And they are also, for the most part, that is currently trying to put sanctions onto Russia for the war with Ukraine. The other bloc that is evolving is ASEAN, which is 10 Asian countries that have come together, and that group is growing and very, very strong when it comes to how much of the world population are they representing. Then another bloc is called BRICS, which was originally started with just these few countries, but now there are 15 applications from other countries around the world. And BRICS is in an interesting situation because they are seriously contemplating to also come up with a new currency where the BRICS countries can trade with each other. Most people think they will first set up a certain set of rules, build a common currency that is backed up by gold and other commodities so that they can use that currency as an exchange and don't need to use the dollar anymore. So why did I say have or own a cake and eat it too? This G7 statement basically said, we want to still do trade with China and other Asian countries, but they have to follow our philosophy, our rules, and every time they don't, we punish them. And I believe, and this is the news from this meeting just ended last weekend, what I believe is happening is ultimately these countries in Asia are not just growing economically and militarily and influential through initiatives in Africa, in South America, and so forth, but they will also be rather triggered, especially China, to say, okay, we have taken technology that has either been offered to us, that we have copied when we very first started 50 years ago. There were t-shirts copied and handbags copied and calculators copied and so forth. So the Chinese especially are really good at copying, taking a piece of technology, taking it apart and see how it works. And nowadays, a lot of the technologies that we get from there, not only do they have a market dominating position, but their stuff is actually as good, if not better, than what the West has been able to produce. So in my opinion, all this we want to de-risk but not decouple is not going to work. As soon and as long as we keep saying we want to have a relationship, but we are the ones who dictate how it's going, we tell you what you can and cannot do, we tell you which computer chip you can put in which application but not in the other, you don't have the freedom to decide how to use the stuff that we sell to you. Or if you want to use it for something that we don't like, we're just not going to sell it to you. What it will lead to is that especially China will be on track to come up with their own solutions. And one thing that is very interesting, and we can put that in the show notes, is there's a recent study that has been conducted that showed across 37 high-tech industry sectors out of 44, China and Chinese universities are currently leading and publishing the most papers compared to the rest of the world. Second is the United States and then some European countries. So what does that mean? Their population is not just younger than the Western countries, but their population is also more eager, extremely motivated to learn. And for many, many years, they went to Harvard and Yale and UC Berkeley and all these kind of high-end universities until we said, okay, well, we want your money, but we don't want you to take any of the information and knowledge back home. But we are also throwing you out if your visa or work permit expires and you have to go home in 60 days. Now, in China, there are lots of universities and research institutions that are based on these first generation researchers that came back or were kicked out, and they are now developing this stuff. And while Intel, for example, is priding itself to make 4 and 3 nanometer chips in the laboratory, the Chinese are now at the 7 nanometers level. What does that mean? In most stuff that you and I use, it's 28 or 14. So they're down to 7. It's not very far anymore. And the question is, okay, if a 4 nanometer chip is twice as good as a 7 or 8 nanometer chip, yes, that's amazing performance. But if you want to get the same performance, you just take 2 7 or 8 nanometer chips and you get the same results. And that's what they're going to do. And this notion that we can avoid that they ultimately say, we don't need you anymore, that I think is a fool's errand. I think this will happen. And rather than having the confrontation, I believe it would have been much better to try to collaborate, but that is no longer in the cards. Kind of like the lines have been drawn, and to say, okay, we're calling it de-risking and not decoupling. I believe it is actually decoupling. And the question ultimately will be, who will be better off? Are we better off when we de-risk or decouple, or would we have been better off to collaborate and basically work together for a common goal? I think the latter is true, but I think that train has left the station. So I can encourage you, as news of the week, look at this G7 final statement, look at this research report about the 44 high-tech technologies, out of which 37 are led by China, and make up your own mind how you actually use this information for your investing and how you allocate your money in the different places to diversify, so that you don't have everything just in dollars or everything just in real estate or everything just in certain stocks or other investments and get caught flat-footed. So we'll have to keep seeing and watching what's happening with the debt ceiling, what's happening with this de-risking versus decoupling, and how this kind of really volatile environment that we're living in right now and probably for a couple of more years to come is going to ultimately evolve and resolve. So be well, stay safe, and I talk to you next week.